Nobody doubts that Jesus read the Old Testament in Hebrew, the original language. However, it seems that Jesus also read the Old Testament in a translation. In this video, we're going to talk about what that translation is and why it's still important today and how you can even get a hold of a copy and read it for yourself. Hi, I'm Daryl Burling from Master New Testament Greek, here to help you with the tools, habits, and system to master the Greek of the New Testament. If you'd like the idea of reading the Old Testament and the New Testament in the ancient languages, then go ahead, hit the subscribe button and the notify bell. That way you find out when new videos are released. If you do like this video and it's helpful, hit the like button. That really helps the YouTube algorithm to know that this is a helpful video as well. Jesus using a translation? That sounds loony. What translation would he use, and how would you know that he's using a translation? Well, those are very good questions. And of course, the translation we're talking about is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which we often refer to today as the Septuagint, or you may refer to it as the Septuagint. There's discussion about which of those pronunciations is correct. What is the Septuagint? The Septuagint is, we refer to it today as the Greek translation of the whole Old Testament, but originally it really just refers to the Pentateuch. And the reason for that goes back to the story behind where the Septuagint comes from. The story goes that in the 3rd century BC, the library at Alexandria sought to get a hold of a copy of the Torah, what we call today the Pentateuch, for the library that sat there, the great library at Alexandria at the time. So the librarian there sent a letter to the high priest in Jerusalem asking him to send a copy of the Torah and some people to do the translation. And so the story goes that the high priest sent a copy of the Torah from the temple in Jerusalem to Alexandria, along with 6 men from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, which makes 72 men in total. Now, there's all sorts of reasons why we should not necessarily believe that story, but that story explains how we got the title of Septuagint. The word Septuagint simply means 70, and you'll often see the Septuagint abbreviated as LXX, which is Roman numerals for 50 plus 10 plus 10, or 70. Now, 70, 72, it's just abbreviated down to 70, and hence Septuagint. So that's how we get the name. Now, like I mentioned, this is probably not true. There's a bunch of reasons why. I'm not going to go into those reasons in this video. But nonetheless, this is how we got the Septuagint, and it originally referred to just the Torah. Over the following 200 to 300 years, the rest of the Old Testament and the Apocrypha was translated from Hebrew into Greek as well. And there's some variation in how that translation was done. The Pentateuch, for instance, was quite a literal translation. So that original translation of the Pentateuch was quite literal, but then later translations have varied quite a lot. Now, this doesn't mean that the Septuagint is not important because it has these different translations. We get into some of the same translation discussions we get with modern translations. It's still important. In fact, it's even more important, and I'll talk about why that is in just a moment. The next question that comes up is, well, how do we know that this was the translation that Jesus used? To establish this, we go to the New Testament and we look at passages where Jesus is quoting from the Old Testament. Let's go, for example, to Matthew chapter 7. And here in Matthew chapter 7, we have this quotation from Isaiah 29 verse 13. Jesus says, "This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far away from me." And in verse 9, "But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men." If we go to the New American Standard, which is translating from the Hebrew, we get the Hebrew sense of this. And so the translation from verse 9 and from the Hebrew of Isaiah chapter 29 verse 13 says, "And their reverence for me consists of tradition, learnt by rote." And you can see that's very different to verse 9 in Matthew chapter 7. But the Septuagint, on the other hand, is, "And they worship me futilely." Now, this is my very poor wooden translation. A better translation would be pretty much the way Jesus says it: "In vain they worship me, teaching commandments and instructions of men." The Matthew chapter 7 is far closer to the Septuagint than it is to the Masoretic text or to the Hebrew or to the New American Standard translation. Now, this is not just an isolated case. There seems to be a number of cases. In fact, what scholars have observed is when Jesus is quoting from the Old Testament in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he tends to be more closer to the Septuagint translation than to the Hebrew. Now, there are times where he's closer to the Hebrew than to the Septuagint, but the quantity of these seems to be closely Septuagintal, or more like the Septuagint than the Hebrew. This leads us to think that Jesus was at least very conversant with the Septuagint, even if he's not always quoting directly from it. But he certainly takes his lead from the Septuagint in those Gospels, which leads us to think that he was very conversant with the translation, the Greek Old Testament translation, and even used that perhaps more readily than the Hebrew at times. So, does this mean that we should prioritize the Septuagint over the Hebrew? Not necessarily. But it's just helpful for us to see that Jesus probably used the Septuagint a lot, and it informed the way he used the Old Testament. This leads into another discussion about why the Septuagint is important for us today. Let me give you 3 reasons, other than the fact that Jesus seems to quote from the Septuagint a reasonable amount. Let me give you 3 additional reasons why we should care about the Septuagint today. The first one is that the Septuagint captures the Old Testament at a particular point in time and translates it from the ancient Hebrew into, at that stage, a modern Greek culture. In other words, what it gives us is it gives us a cultural snapshot of how the Jews understood the Hebrew Old Testament to be understood, how it was to be read in many cases. Now, in some cases, it's not so much how they read it, but it could be that they actually had a slightly different Hebrew text. So all of these are discussions that go on in the scholarly world around how we should understand the Hebrew and also the Greek of the Old Testament. And some of the ramifications of this is it seems to be that the Greek of the Old Testament sometimes influences the theology of the New Testament and of the church fathers as well. For instance, in Proverbs chapter 8, there's this discussion about wisdom was in the beginning with God. And it's the Greek translation of that text that seems to have led to this discussion that Jesus was wisdom and therefore was with God in the beginning as wisdom. In other words, this representation and understanding that Jesus is the fulfillment of what we see in Proverbs chapter 8 seems to come from the Septuagint translation. And so what we see there is that the Greek translation of the Septuagint seems to be informing the theological discussions and understanding of the apostolic fathers throughout the early church. And so we see here that this is very influential in some of these discussions that take place in the early church and lead to many of the doctrines that we have today. Does that mean to say that they're different to what we find in the Hebrew Old Testament? No, of course not. But again, it's just influential, and that's really the point I'm trying to make. In other words, the Old Testament written in Greek, this translation of Greek is a snapshot of a very early understanding of what the Hebrew was saying, which is then very influential in the development of theology in the New Testament and in the post-New Testament period. The second reason the Greek Old Testament is important today is because many of the other quotations we have in the New Testament also seem to quote from the Septuagint as well. Now, we've already seen that, one example of that from Jesus himself, but there are other passages in the Bible, in the New Testament, that quote from the Greek translation of the Old Testament as well. So just like the King James translation of the Bible has influenced how we use English today, and many of the Bible translations we have today, so too the Greek translation of the Old Testament influences how the thinkers of the New Testament, the writers of the New Testament, often thought about the Old Testament. And so for this reason, it's very important for us to make those connections as well. Again, not exclusively, because we still value the original language of the Old Testament, but the Greek translation of the Old Testament is also really important when it comes to understanding the New Testament as well. In fact, it could be that the Septuagint is quoted or alluded to as many as 300 times in the New Testament, which makes it really a foundational document for understanding the New Testament. So before I give you the third reason why the Greek translation of the Old Testament, what we refer to as the Septuagint, is helpful, let me ask you just to give this video a thumbs up. So we've seen that it's an early interpretation of the Old Testament. It's an early representation and understanding, a snapshot, if you like, of how the Jews understood the Old Testament. We've also seen that it's the text most used in the New Testament by both Jesus and also other writers. And thirdly, the Old Testament is important for us to read in Greek because it's going to help us better understand the New Testament. What do I mean by that? Well, here's the thing. Often when we come to the New Testament and we look at it for the first time and start to translate our first Greek sentences, what we find there is that our knowledge of the English translations helps us to interpret the Greek. And so we are able to say, for God so loved the world, because we understand and we know this verse really well. And that helps us to translate it into Greek as well. Sometimes that makes us lazy, and we need to be careful with that. But here's the thing, when we go to the Greek Old Testament, we will find that we don't know it as well, because typically we're better versed in the New Testament as Christians than we are in the Old Testament. And so reading the Old Testament in Greek gives us another source of koine that we can experience, that we can understand, and it's going to force us to do a better job with learning the Greek language itself. And this in turn will help us to understand the New Testament much better. We're going to see the New Testament more vividly, and we're not going to be so blinkered, if you like, by our translations that we know so well. And this has some benefits because it's going to increase your confidence in Koine Greek, and that is going to increase your enjoyment of the reading. So I encourage you to read the Greek Old Testament in Greek and get your head around it. Spend some time with it, grow in confidence with it, and grow in familiarity with it, and just let it illuminate the New Testament for you as well. Now, it doesn't mean to say you should stop reading your Old Testament in Hebrew. I think you should keep doing that, or you should read your English translation from the Hebrew. I think that's really important because this is still just a translation, right? But it's just a helpful translation, and it has a lot of benefit for us today as well. So let me ask you a question as we close. Have you read anything in the Old Testament from the Greek translation? Have you read an English translation of Greek? Have you looked at the Greek of the Old Testament? Have you purchased a Septuagint for yourself? Have you purchased the Reader's Edition of the Septuagint perhaps? I'm going to leave a link to those resources below so you can go get a copy for yourself. It's well worth having a copy on your shelf, even if it's just an English edition. Let me know in the comment section below if you've ever looked at this, or if you're interested in looking at this, or if you've got any questions about the Greek Old Testament. I look forward to seeing and interacting with you there. In the meantime, keep taking small steps toward mastery of the Greek language, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. We'll see you there.